Having spent a considerable part of my academic career researching, reading, writing, and thinking about Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, on occasion, the people in my life have become curious about this mysterious and unusually named Irishman who seems to occupy my thoughts endlessly. Once in a while, an adventurous friend might even ask if I could recommend a story of Le Fanu's that they might read, which is a gesture that I'm always very touched by. Unfailingly, I always recommend green tea, and until I came to compose this vlog, I never stopped to think about why that is. Green tea is not my favourite Le Fanu story, nor does it even make the top 10, probably. And in fact, I think I've only read it about 3 or 4 times, which compared to my other readings of his work is especially low. Why then do I consistently recommend green tea as an entry point to In a Glass Darkly, and both as an introduction to Le Fanu? On one hand, the answer is quite simple. It is one of the best ghost stories ever written. Additionally, the ready availability of In a Glass Darkly makes it the most convenient to recommend. After all, it's a mere Amazon click away, and in fact, it is the only Le Fanu short story collection that remains perpetually in print 150 years since it was first published. On the other hand, if one did not recommend green tea, what other text would be as accessible to a Le Fanu novice? Green tea is a distillation of Le Fanu's work, within which one can trace all the hallmarks of his idiosyncratic style: subject matter, prose, exposition, and denouement. Characters and artifices that Le Fanu experimented with for over 3 decades find perfect expression in the short tale, which makes it an ideal ingress for those new to Le Fanu. Green tea is a litmus test for Le Fanu. If you're captivated by the strange tale, chances are you'll be persuaded to dig a little deeper into his work. However, the neatly crafted tale, while indicative of Le Fanu's talent as a writer and the culmination of many years in perfecting his craft, is also completely misrepresentative of the confusing, discordant, and sometimes baffling nature of his opus. His body of work is unruly. He jumps genres, from short tales to poetry, from historic tomes to ghost stories, from sensation novels to fairy tales and political edicts. Literary interpretation and analysis demands coherence. Ideally, to be able to pull out a single thread of unity that can rationalize and illuminate a thought process and offer new insight into an author's work. For decades, academics, including myself, have striven to regulate Le Fanu's work, to find order in the chaos, and to offer a coherent taxonomy of ideas and influences, and thereby speculate on his true authorial intentions as he processed the world around him at a tumultuous time in Victorian Ireland. If we look at In a Glass Darkly collection, and it is easy to tell that the overarching narrative of Dr Hesselius and his anonymous apprentice is kind of awkwardly applied to some of the stories. The framework, which is organic only to green tea and not originally part of the other 4 stories, adds a superficial coherence that serves to confuse rather than enhance our understanding of Le Fanu and his works. Over the remaining minutes of this paper, my intention is to offer an alternative perspective on Le Fanu's most acclaimed work by tracing back some of the antecedents to In a Glass Darkly and noting some pitfalls that can befall the reader and scholar alike when dealing with Le Fanu's many posthumous publications. My intention is to promote a fuller understanding of Le Fanu's writing, rewriting, and publishing habits, and to argue that his work must be situated within the broader material context in which he operated. So I just want to mention here that much of this present analysis builds upon research I conducted for my PhD at Trinity College and last year for my monograph on Le Fanu, so I would just like to acknowledge both works as precursors to the present analysis, and also to thank the University of Wales Press for their gracious permission to reproduce verbally some of the ideas contained within the book. So, let us begin with the facts, or at least as close as we can get to them. Officially, Le Fanu has published around 42 short stories, 15 novels, 4 ballads or poems, 3 of what we could classify as novellas, 3 short story collections, and numerous editorials, reviews, and newspaper articles, including a satirical pamphlet or 2. All in all, a decent output for one man over the course of 35 years, especially when we consider that the Victorian 3-volume novel typically ran to around 180,000 words or 60 to 80,000 words per volume, each volume being the equivalent to one modern novel. So we could in fact probably triple his novel output. The facts and stats of Le Fanu's output come with an enormous caveat, however. It is virtually impossible to account for all of Le Fanu's published and unpublished works, though many have made valiant efforts. The confusion of Le Fanu's body of work is due in part to the Victorian fashion for anonymised fiction, as well as the trend for fiction concealed as historical artifice, thereby eluding the true author's name, and also in large part due to Le Fanu's own habit of rewriting and republishing his fiction. So as we can see here in this first publication of Le Fanu's The House by the Churchyard in the Dublin University magazine, the author is cited as Charles de Crasseron, whom we know is an ancestor of Le Fanu's, but just as an illustration here that Le Fanu does not appear as the author for this text. So we consider the stories that comprise In a Glass Darkly. Each one was published previously in various Irish and British magazines, later compiled as a collection by Le Fanu. Following the sale of the Dublin University magazine in the summer of 1869, of which Le Fanu was the owner and editor for almost a decade, he produced quite a lot of work, including the stories that comprise the collection at hand. So Green Tea was first published in Charles Dickens's successful weekly magazine All the Year Round, and that was from October to November 1869, so just after he had sold the Dublin University magazine. Carmilla was published in the Dark Blue from December 1871 to March 1872, The Room at the Dragon Volant in London Society from February to June 72, and The Haunted House in Westminster, published in January 1872. And this was retitled in the same year to Mr. Justice Harbottle for the In a Glass Darkly collection, while The Familiar, which has two previous iterations as The Watcher in 1847 and 1841. So each of these previous publications can be studied within their unique material contexts, as well as forming part of the 1872 collection. In some cases, the existing material contexts are more significant than others. The publication of Green Tea in Dickens's magazine was a personal triumph for Le Fanu, and we can kind of tell that here from this excerpt from a letter sent by Le Fanu to his long-standing publisher Bentley. Here we can see Le Fanu using the successful publication of Green Tea the year before, using Dickens as leverage for this new novel, The Rose and Key, which he is trying to convince Bentley to publish. So the stories Le Fanu submitted to All the Year Round are in many ways influenced by the material conditions of the magazine and wrought by the specifications of its illustrious editor. In addition to studying the stories as part of the In a Glass Darkly collection, they must also be considered to be composed in reaction to changing trends in popular readership in the late 19th century, particularly in terms of presenting Irish stories for circulation in the British press. All the Year Round is one of the most successful periodicals in Victorian Britain, and it published weekly. It had an average circulation of 100,000 copies, which peaked at 300,000 copies in the 1860s. So a lot of people were reading this, and it was a huge step up for Le Fanu. The 1869 version of Green Tea differs very little to the version published in a Glass Darkly, less than 3 years later. Likewise, The Room in the Dragon Volant and Carmilla. Both texts were altered just enough to comply with the Hesselius framework for the 1872 collection. Mr. Justice Harbottle is based upon an earlier story of Le Fanu's set in Dublin. An account of some strange disturbances in an old house in Ainger Street was first published in the Dublin University magazine in 1853, and this was at a time when Le Fanu was writing a lot of Dublin set stories and novels. Though transporting the location from Dublin to London for Mr. Justice Harbottle, Le Fanu retains the central plot of a young lodger haunted by the ghost of a vindictive judge, though much expanded in this case to include the background of the judge in question. Curiously, Le Fanu does not change the location of his other Dublin-based story in a Glass Darkly, which is The Familiar. The Familiar differs little from its previous two versions of The Watcher, although, as I will explain, the previous material contexts are important nonetheless. The Watcher was first published in November 1847 in the Dublin University magazine, the seminal Victorian Irish periodical that Le Fanu was involved with for most of his adult life. In the 1847 version of The Watcher, the subtitle reads, "From the Reminiscences of a Bachelor." And so the tale commences with this first-person narration in the style of the individual, plainly the bachelor of the title, recounting occurrences from his life 50 years since. For those of you familiar with the story, you might recall that the unnamed narrator of The Watcher describes himself as a friend of the protagonist, Captain Barton. And this person is in Barton's company when he first encounters the Watcher face to face, which is outside the Irish Parliament in this version. This narrator is the bachelor, as clearly indicated in the 1847 version of the story, though this is less apparent in the later versions. 2 months later, in January 1848, Le Fanu published another story in the same magazine. This is a lesser spotted story of his called The Fatal Bride. Here again, the readers very deliberately introduced to the character of the bachelor, this time carrying the subtitle being the second contribution from the Reminiscence of a Bachelor, and featuring a longer preambulatory introduction by this bachelor, as well as taking a more central role in the story he recounts. The Watcher and The Fatal Bride are companion stories, though they've rarely been recognised as such, and in fact The Fatal Bride was entirely out of print until a 2014 edition by Swan River Press. So Swan River Press have done great service to Le Fanu and his work in their efforts to reconstruct his original publishing contexts, and so they published both stories under Reminiscence of a Bachelor for the first time ever with this edition. The dominant trend has been to read The Watcher as part of Le Fanu's first short story collection in 1851, Ghost Stories and Tales of Mystery. This was published just 4 years after the first version of The Watcher, and it omits the subtitle referencing the bachelor, as well as some other curious textual changes, which I do cover in my book, but which I will not detain you with here. It's through this editorial act, and many more besides, that The Watcher and The Fatal Bride were lost as co-texts. And moreover, Le Fanu's rationale in collecting the stories that make up Ghost Stories and Tales of Mystery remains aloof. After all, it was his decision not to include The Fatal Bride in that collection, just 3 years after he had written and published it as a co-text to The Watcher. Ghost Stories and Tales of Mystery is a strange assortment of tales, as with In a Glass Darkly, which features the third and more significant rewrite of The Watcher as the familiar, neither collection could be considered cohesive. The stories within each have no strong thematic link, though over the years many have sought out and suggested convincing connections. In fact, every story in this collection is a rewritten version of an earlier text. As we've come to expect from collections in a broad sense, a collection implies a gathering of related items, be they stories, songs, artifacts, comic books, shoes, stamps, and so forth. But perhaps this is a specifically modern affliction to expect an arc of coherence in a Victorian anthology of tales. We would do well to remember that at the end of the day, Le Fanu was a writer by trade, and so to gather some of what he probably considered at the time to be his best stories, and to repackage them into a small, saleable edition was likely a strategic marketing decision and not a question of style. Published 20 years after Ghost Stories and Tales of Mystery, In a Glass Darkly differs only in that Le Fanu took the extra step to expand the Hyselius framing narrative from Green Tea by adding a prologue to the 4 subsequent tales. What the complexity of The Watcher serves to highlight here is the extant material precedency of the stories that comprise In a Glass Darkly. The collection itself cannot be analysed or understood in isolation from these co-texts and contexts. While it is absolutely valid to analyse In a Glass Darkly as a collection and to unpick the intertextuality of the 5 stories, overlooking these previous iterations of each text is a fatal misstep and must form part of one's textual interpretation. Further to being mindful of the material antecedents to Le Fanu's short story collections, equally, we must be cautious to differentiate from a number of confusingly titled posthumous anthologies, and in this section I will illustrate a few examples of these. So in 1894, London publisher Edmund Downey produced The Watcher and Other Weird Stories, and this was a quote-unquote new collection containing another version of The Watcher, this time alongside 5 stories from much earlier in Le Fanu's writing career. Similarly, in 1945, Arkham House, which is an American publishing house, released Green Tea and Other Stories, which contains a random assortment of tales from various collections and periods in Le Fanu's life, including pairing Strange Disturbances in Anger Street alongside its rewritten version of Mr. Justice Harbottle, which is a strange presentation for readers. If you've been listening carefully, you might also have noticed that I mention only 3 short story collections by Le Fanu and not 4, and it is due to the confusion of posthumous anthologies that I make this very clear distinction. Le Fanu's collections are Ghost Stories and Tales of Mystery, Chronicles of Golden Friars, and of course, In a Glass Darkly. But you may be wondering about the Purcell Papers, which is Le Fanu's collection of stories set in rural Ireland in the 18th century. The Purcell Papers are an important text, though not for the reason you might think. The collection gathers together Le Fanu's earliest stories from when he first began publishing his work in the late 1830s. He had then graduated from Trinity College Dublin and eschewed a career in law for one in journalism. For the first 2 years of his writing career, Le Fanu wrote exclusively in the guise of the fictional Father Francis Purcell, proto-folklorist and antiquarian, and published these stories solely in the Dublin University magazine. In a foreshadowing of his alias and his anonymous age, the fictional Father Purcell also has an anonymous assistant who, he tells us, has collected the late priest's papers and presents them for the readers of the magazine in the present day. Purcell's stories are invariably tales of the waning Catholic aristocracy in 17th century Ireland and tales of the rural Catholic peasantry during the time of the penal laws. These 12 stories were gathered long after Le Fanu's death to form the collection we know now as the Purcell Papers, and this is with the addition of a 13th tale, which is very difficult to say as an Irish person, Billy Maloney's Taste of Love and Glory. And this is a short story published in the Dublin University magazine a decade later than the others and without this framing narrative of Purcell. This 1880 collection was compiled by Alfred Percival Graves, and it's published in 3 volumes by Bentley and Son, who was a London-based publisher, and he had a long-standing publishing relationship with Le Fanu during his life. So the collection came a full 40 years after the final Purcell story appeared in the pages of the Dublin University magazine. Le Fanu stopped writing these stories in 1840. So correspondences between Bentley and Graves appear as early as December 1873, so that's less than a year after Le Fanu's sudden death in February of the same year. The collection's introduction cum memoir is also written by Graves, and it belies the fact that he really was not that well acquainted with Le Fanu, but he did know the family. Graves also consulted with Le Fanu's brother William about what stories might form part of the collection, and in these letters it is plain to see that Graves was not very familiar with Le Fanu's work. At one point, when proffering his services as editor to Bentley and seeking to assuage concerns over copyright, Graves went so far as to claim that he had corresponded with Le Fanu's eldest son, Philip, stating, "I have received a letter from Philip Le Fanu, son of Joseph's, expressing his satisfaction at the idea of my editing his father's Irish stories." In fact, Philip Le Fanu had died the previous year, in December 1878. The point of explaining this minute detail of context is to reveal the various forces at work in compiling something like a short story collection at this time. There was a significant amount of money at stake here. Le Fanu's career had accelerated in the last years of his life, and he had a prolific output between 1869 and 1873, with a number of texts in active publication at the time of his death. As a result, interest in anthologizing and capitalizing upon his work was at its peak in these years immediately following his death. Graves negotiated £50 for editing the Purcell Papers, which equates to over £4,000 in today's money. Understanding Graves' motivation in compiling the Purcell Papers should give one pause for thought when considering the collection as a construction of Le Fanu's imagination. Yes, Le Fanu composed the stories with the conscious unifying framework of Purcell, but curiously he never collected the stories himself in his lifetime. It is certainly possible that Le Fanu might have arranged the Purcell collection himself at a later date, and certainly the stories do fit together very nicely in the Graves edition. But the point being made here is that the stories must be considered within the context of the periodical in which they first appeared, that being the Dublin University magazine, and not in the collection that was curated at a much, much later date, wherein the chief intention of composition was profit. Moreover, the stories were written with the magazine in mind, designed deliberately with the artifice of the Catholic Father Purcell for what was a staunchly Protestant readership. Taken out of context of the Dublin University magazine and read instead as the 1880 collection, these socio-political and historic contexts are lost entirely. And as such, it is advisable to approach all posthumous collections of Le Fanu's stories with a degree of caution and some very careful reading. I will close with a final and brief example of yet another posthumous editorial decision that has led to confusion regarding Le Fanu's work. Of his 3 short story collections, Le Fanu curated only one with any overt coherence, and that is Chronicles of Golden Friars. These stories appear to have been conceived of as a collection before Le Fanu commenced writing, and that's mainly given the unifying fictional location of Golden Friars. The collection was published by Bentley in 1871, although, as usual, each of the stories were published previously and in completely different periodicals, so I've listed those on screen. It's worth mentioning as an aside that The Haunted Baronet is also a considerable rewrite of The Fortunes of Sir Robert Arda, which is Le Fanu's second Purcell story and was published in 1838. Crucially, however, Chronicles of Golden Friars must not be confused with A Chronicle of Golden Friars and Other Stories, which was published by Edmund Downey in 1896. Although almost identically titled, compared to the former, the latter collection retains only The Bird of Passage, which is retitled as A Chronicle of Golden Friars. And this is put alongside 4 Purcell stories and Billy Maloney's Taste of Love and Glory, which you'll remember is not a Purcell story but was included by Graves in the Purcell Papers in 1880. So in fact, I was unable to even find an image of Chronicles of Golden Friars of an original copy, which just goes to show the difficulty in sourcing these original Le Fanu co-texts. Yet again, we have encountered a nebulous textual and publication history surrounding what seems like Le Fanu's straightforward short story collection. What this paper has shown is the many complexities involved in categorising Le Fanu's work. It's easy to recommend something like Green Tea or In a Glass Darkly to a curious reader who is blissfully unaware of the true contextual complexity of what appears on the surface to be a straightforward collection of supernatural tales. Perhaps what is so intriguing to scholars is exactly this complexity. Le Fanu's work can be interpreted and taxonomized in such a variety of ways that it yields fresh impressions with each reading. Hopefully this paper has inspired some of you to look again at Le Fanu's work, even at those seemingly straightforward texts. I will close with a quote from Dr Hesselius in Green Tea, on the occasion of his first visit to the Reverend Jennings at his home in London. Hesselius is struck by Jennings's library with its rich dark curtains, Turkey carpet, and a covering of books. Stored with books on every side, from floor to ceiling, I stepped into this very silent room of a very silent house, with a peculiar foreboding, and its darkness and solemn clothing of books, for except where 2 narrow looking glasses were set in the wall, they were everywhere. Thank you.